what you want to do.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Andrew Schneider. I'm Executive Director of Fairness West Virginia. Fairness West Virginia is the statewide LGBT civil rights organization. And our ultimate goal is adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the State Human Rights Act that bans discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations.
Wow.
And that would seem to be sort of,
Basic.
yeah, fundamental. But believe it or not, it's something that we are still struggling with, even 3 years after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality. And what's odd about it too is that, let's consider that the LGBT civil rights movement, when it got started, figured that these basic non-discrimination protections would come first and marriage equality would come last. That usually is the way it works. That's what happened with the civil rights struggle for African Americans, and we figured the same would be the case with the LGBT civil rights struggle. Am I supposed to take questions?
However you want to do this, it's up
And
to
it
you.
looks like you have a question.
Sorry.
Okay, it's less of a question, but more of a thing saying the main reason there's still discrimination, homophobes.
Mm-hmm.
We know.
Absolutely.
Lots of them.
Yeah. Well,
Listen.
there is certainly lots of people, not just homophobes, but lots of people who harbor prejudices that I think we will always be dealing with, even long after we pass these laws. But these laws at least will, if not deter, protect those who are vulnerable in our society. And so with the LGBT civil rights movement, when marriage equality arrived first, it was like having the icing on the cake before the cake was ever baked. And it's put us in somewhat of an, believe it or not, ironically, an awkward position, because on the one hand, it's made some people a little complacent, like our rights have been achieved, but on the other hand, there's some real urgency to our problems now, to the problems of discrimination, because now that we all can get married, we're that much more visible. Consider, we can go to our office with a ring on our finger, reflecting that we're married. We can put a picture of our spouse on our desk, just like our heterosexual counterparts. We can talk about what our family does by the water cooler, just like everyone else who's married. We can even bring our spouse to the company picnic. These are all things that have now become more possible and more likely because of marriage equality. But at the same time, it makes us more visible. So if we happen to have a homophobic employer, a boss that we work for that does not like gay people, that puts us in greater jeopardy of being fired or being denied housing or even being kicked out of a restaurant or a hotel. So that's why there's some urgency to our efforts right now. And believe it or not, there are only 18 states that now ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And there are an additional 3 states that just ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So the majority of states still do not provide these protections. And since the marriage equality decision was handed down by the Supreme Court, 0 states have been able to pass this legislation in their state legislatures, in part because of the backlash. And the backlash has been pretty severe to the marriage equality decision. Right after the Supreme Court's case, the next legislative sessions all across the country, there were bills introduced that would strip LGBT people of their basic rights. And many of these bills were cloaked under this theory that people of faith should have the right to discriminate if their conscience dictated that. And many of these bills were called Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what we call them were license to discriminate bills. Because, as I said, they allowed people to discriminate in the name of religion. And that's sort of what the crux of what I want to talk about. We, as an organization, have decided we need to take back that mantle of religion, because it doesn't proclaim that one has the right to discriminate in the name of God. It doesn't. There's no passage in the Bible anywhere that says that you cannot have a business transaction with someone you believe is a sinner. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. The highest principle of the Bible and of all religions is what is known as the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, if that's the highest principle, non-discrimination should be a no-brainer for every believer. Every believer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened with the License to Discriminate bill back in 2016. Probably one of the biggest political fights of my life. I was told early on by some highly placed political officials in the West Virginia state government that this was coming down the pike and that we needed to be prepared. That apparently the speaker that year, who's still in power, Speaker Armstead, had said that the highest priority of the legislative session for him was to adopt that License to Discriminate bill, because he considered this to be part of his principles.
Faith mandate.
Yeah, exactly. His religious principles. And we had even heard that he had threatened the Senate that if they had failed to run this bill after the House passed it out, that he would sit on every single piece of Senate legislation that made it back to the House side. So basically, the Senate couldn't afford to not run this bill because they couldn't afford to lose their other legislative priorities. So we were up against the entire establishment. The speaker, we were told, even went to the president of the Chamber of Commerce in West Virginia, because we thought they might be a natural ally of ours. In other states where these bills had been introduced, the Chamber of Commerce actually helped to if not prevent a bill from like this from passing, they ultimately were able to put enough pressure of the business community against the legislature to make sure that a bill like that was vetoed by the governor, or that in Indiana's case, the bill was ultimately repealed. And because business knows very well that these laws are not just bad for the LGBT community, they're bad for business. Businesses don't want to locate in states that discriminate because they're trying to attract the best and brightest employees. And if those best and brightest employees see that a state is discriminatory and not inclusive, they're not going to want to relocate there. And that could cost a major company valuable workforce. And so in our case, the speaker at that point in this legislative fight told the Chamber of Commerce, "Do you want your right to work bill?" And of course, that was one of their highest priorities. And they said, if you want your right to work bill, you need to zip it on RFRA. You need to, stay out of the fight on the License to Discriminate bill. And by the way, as I said, it's called Religious Freedom Restoration Act, so I sometimes refer to it by its acronym RFRA. And so then, to other, lobbying entities like the hospitality industry made similar threats, and similar threats to even the universities. So while WVU had members of their staff had come out against RFRA early on, when we needed them to do high-profile interviews to oppose it, they were less willing to and less confident to be able to be out there by our side, because they also had their budget in the balance. They needed the legislature to pass their budget, which the speaker has a lot of control over, and they didn't want to jeopardize that. So in many ways, Fairness West Virginia and a couple of progressive groups, we were going it alone. And that bill passed out of the House by 72 votes, 72 out of 100. everyone thought that it was on an express train of passage. You know, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to pull this, you know, just be able to stop it. And at the same time, we've also been working on municipal non-discrimination ordinances, because the feeling is the state is taking so long to act. We need to protect our community as soon as possible in any way we can. And getting local communities to adopt the same laws that we want to adopt on the state level will at least provide some of our people the protections that they need. And at that time, we were working. Yes.
Just want to briefly interrupt, because you're using a lot of political terms and all that stuff. Do you know what he's talking about?
I haven't really been listening very much.
Bless us, sorry,
Yeah.
that's the truth.
Just to sum it up, he's talking about the fact that it's still legal in this state to fire
Yeah, I
somebody for
understand
being
that.
gay, or kick somebody out of their house for being gay. If they
Or
were-
just LGBTQ plus, rather.
Yeah, it's still legal here to do all that. He's talking about fighting against it. So that's just,
Yeah.
I just want you to
I
understand.
know, I can understand it.
Gotcha. Sorry.
No problem. Try to make it more interesting.
That's okay. He's the only kid here.
So,
Well, no, he's not. I forget he's still young.
And tall.
Yeah.
so, anyways, these municipal campaigns were also hitting a bump in the road, because you may recall that in the city of Houston, 2015,
Joe.
the opposition.
I think this is the winter thaw.
Yeah.
How does one service attract so many people?
It's great. Isn't it exciting, Scott?
It's cool. Hi, welcome.
Let's put this together. We don't have to.
Patience.
You're on rollers, careful. We can all switch back. Hey, sorry.
So, as I was talking about, we had a number of municipal campaigns that we were working on to pass laws that would ban discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations for both sexual orientation and gender identity. And we were focused at that time in Lewisburg. This was in the beginning of 2016. And just prior to that, a couple months before, in Houston, the city of Houston, Texas, our opposition had unveiled this new attack. They felt that if they could target transgender people, because they were the least understood members of our community, and use them as the boogeyman, that they might be able to stop the progress that we've made towards full LGBT equality. And they were desperate, because they just witnessed the Supreme Court granting marriage equality. They saw that there was this push towards non-discrimination around the country. They needed something to stop us in our tracks, and they felt that this was the ticket. And it was brutal. It was brutal what they did, and then they're still doing. And they ran TV commercials. They had signs go up all over the city of Houston, spent millions of dollars, and it actually succeeded. I hate to say it succeeded. They got the city of Houston to repeal their non-discrimination law, because they scared people into thinking that men who shouldn't be in women's restrooms would go in there and attack women and girls, based on the premise that transgender women ought to be using the women's restrooms because of the history of violence that has taken place when they've used the men's restrooms. And they tried to flip the argument, making them the victims when we are really the victims, when transgender people are the victims. So it was very successful, and they figured that if this can work in the 5th largest city in the country, surely this attack will work in a small town in West Virginia. So in early 2016, signs went up all over Lewisburg saying, "Vote no against Ordinance 254 to prevent men from, barging into women's restrooms. And, they were spending quite a bit of money to try to scare people. And at one point, it got so bad that there was the potential of the city delaying the vote on this important non-discrimination measure. And as I said, we were close to losing big time in the House side on the license to discriminate bill. And I was feeling it was one of those situations, if you up there lobbying the Capitol and things are all going against you, you can quickly descend into a deep depression. And so I was not in the highest of spirits, and I had one of my colleagues with me who was doing some video work for us, and she had her camera on her shoulder, and we needed to get the Wi-Fi password. So we went down to the basement of the Capitol, to the Office of Technology, and the director of technology looked at the two of us, sees me in a suit, my colleague with her camera, and asks, "Are you depressed?" But because of our state of mind, what we heard was, "Are you depressed?" Or, "Oh my gosh." I got his attention back. Figured a good anecdote always works. So, as I said then, the legislature passed this license to discriminate bill, and then the fight moved on to the Senate. In some ways, this big defeat was very helpful for us because it started to wake people up. And when we were working on this bill on the House side, on the House of Delegates, people weren't really paying attention. We couldn't seem to get the press to really pay attention. We weren't getting a lot of articles or any media coverage. And then suddenly, this huge defeat gets some national attention, and this sticker campaign arises that you're all probably familiar with. All kinds are welcome here, which with the outline of West Virginia in rainbow colors, with the words "all kinds are welcome here," squeezed in between the outlines of the state. Businesses all around the state started to put that decal in their business windows, and other churches started to have it, and homes, so you could see it almost anywhere you went. And people started to talk about it. People started to volunteer. There started to be more media attention, and then also the Senate was a lot more moderate than the House was, and so the Senate president, at the time he was Senate Majority Leader, I talked to him to see if he would support this amendment that I had worked on with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which would prohibit this discrimination law from undermining any non-discrimination laws in the state, whether it be the state non-discrimination law that excludes protection for sexual orientation and gender identity, or the municipal ordinances that we were successful in passing that include protections for sexual orientation and gender identity. And thankfully, the Senate Majority Leader, agreed to support the amendment. He said, "I'm going to have to vote for the law or the bill as a whole, but I can at least support that amendment so that West Virginia does not stand for discrimination." And I said, that's fine for us because we just want to defang what the law will do. And as long as the law is neutralized, it ceases to become a problem for us. So anyways, we went into the Senate Judiciary meeting, and I wasn't sure if I had the votes, but the Senate Majority Leader felt confident that we did have the votes. And at the end of it was on a Friday night. I was even less confident when I got to the meeting because one of our allies, one of the Democrats on the committee, had to leave to get back to his district to celebrate his mother's 80th birthday party. And so that was one less vote that I would have. And the Majority Leader still felt confident that we would prevail. And by the time the vote took place at 9 o'clock that night, we lost by 2. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're running out of time, we're running out of options. So as we're leaving the meeting, I asked the Senate Majority Leader if he'd be willing to do one last favor for us, which is to support that amendment on the Senate floor. And what he says to me is, yeah, you got my vote. It's going to cost me my election, but West Virginia can't stand for discrimination. And I said to him, I don't think that your constituents will be as hostile towards you as you think. I think they'll actually be a lot more appreciative that you're supporting this amendment than you believe. And while I understand your concern and your fear, you support this. I will do whatever you need of me in your re-election campaign, because you are not doing just a huge favor for our community, the LGBT community, but also for all of West Virginia. And so basically got to the vote, and not only did he vote for that amendment, but he gave this impassioned speech on the floor of the Senate where he described how he was torn. He was torn by his faith because churches in his district were telling him to vote against this amendment. But at the same time, he felt he had an even greater responsibility as a lawmaker for making sure that West Virginia did not even stand for the perception of discrimination. And as he was describing that inner torment, he broke down into tears. He got all choked up. And you can see this on YouTube. Because of his emotional, passionate speech on the floor, he brought us 5 other Republicans we didn't even think we had. And that vote passes by 22-13. The amendment gets attached to that discrimination bill and makes it no longer discriminatory. So, of course, because the bill is now neutralized and cannot do any harm to us now, the proponents of it no longer like their own bill. And so we hear that the sponsors of that discrimination bill are planning to vote against their own bill. And I had talked to a number of Democrats, giving them a pass to vote for the bill as a whole, saying that so they could go back to their districts and say they voted for the religious freedom bill, because they would have already voted for the amendment, which would have made sure that it wouldn't discriminate. And now that I learned that the sponsors of that legislation were going to vote against their own bill, it was now safe for those Democrats to vote against the bill as a whole. So we wanted to maximize the margin of victory. And there was only minutes before the vote was to take place, and I, as a lobbyist, don't have the ability to go onto the floor of the Senate when they're in session, so I had to get word through an attorney to the Senate to pass on word on our behalf, and we could only get to so many Democrats in time, and even still, we defeated that entire law, that entire bill, by a vote of 27-7, essentially snatching victory out of the jaws of defeat. And that was a key moment for us and for the community, because it demonstrated that we have political strength now. More and more people know someone who is LGBT, and that's making all the difference. Our chief opposition is a group called the Family Policy Council of West Virginia. And they were beside themselves in rage because they felt that the Republicans who they had helped to elect had betrayed them, had abandoned them. And so they were going over, they wanted to go after the chief person they felt was responsible for that, which was the Senate Majority Leader. And so they recruited a Tea Party candidate to run against him in the primary, in the Republican primary, who is to the right of him actually on these social issues, was anti-gay and everything, but was actually, believe it or not, to the left of him on labor issues. And so it was this odd combination of labor and the Family Policy Council joining forces to try to defeat the Majority Leader. And the Majority Leader ended up winning by double digits. Even though they attacked him for being, pro-LGBT, anti-religion, he still won by double digits, which was a remarkable feat. And that even despite hundreds of thousands of dollars spent against him. Bless you. And then, if that wasn't enough, Family Policy Council supported the Democrat in the general election running against the Republican majority leader. They so badly wanted to defeat him and set him out as an example for what happens to Republicans who abandon the Family Policy Council. And he even won, the Republican majority leader even won that race too. But the Family Policy Council of West Virginia wasn't done. They then saw there was an opportunity to deny the majority leader the next step in his ascension to the Senate presidency office, because the previous Senate president ran for governor, that was Bill Coles, and lost, but vacated his Senate seat. So there was now an opening to be for the next Senate president, and the majority leader is the next in line, supposed to be the one to, to take that position. Well, the Family Policy Council recruited one of the sponsors of the License to Discriminate bill in the Senate to run against him, to try to deny him that position, that office. And the Senate majority leader even prevailed in that contest too, even though it was very close. And so I'm going to quote here a former U.S. President, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was always very colorful with his words. He said, "Never tell someone to go to hell unless you can be damn sure you can get them there." And as you can see, the Family Policy Council did not follow LBJ's advice. And the next year at the legislature in 2017, they paid the price for that. So both leaders of the legislature, the Speaker and the new Senate President, Mitch Carmichael, made this pact that they would not bring up any social issues, or which really meant they wouldn't bring up any anti-gay legislation. And so it was the first legislative session in my 9 years of lobbying, 3 of those for Fairness West Virginia, but most of those for the ACLU of West Virginia, because that was what I used to do before joining Fairness, in which there was not a single anti-gay bill even introduced in the House of Delegates. Now, most of those years were when the Democrats were in control, and every one of those years there was always an anti-gay bill introduced. And now the Republicans were in charge, and there was not a single anti-gay bill introduced last year. That was remarkable. So it gave me the freedom to be able to work on pro-LGBT legislation. And of course, our highest priority of adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the State Human Rights Act. So Delegate Mike Pushkin, who represents a district near me in Charleston, wanted to become the next torchbearer in helping us to pass this bill, this non-discrimination bill. Yes?
I really apologize. Did you say you had some success with passing stuff on a municipal level?
Yes,
Human
I'll
rights?
get to that in a second. But yeah,
Okay, I'm
we've
sorry.
had a lot of success in
Just
doing
a little
that.
confused about it.
Yeah, no problem. And he wanted to be the lead sponsor of this non-discrimination bill. And I said, sure, that'd be great. I said, would you like me to help you recruit the sponsors on the bill? And he said, yeah, that would be really helpful. So I start going to other House members' offices, asking them if they would sponsor the bill. And I end up getting 8 Republicans to sponsor it, and then 3 Democrats. I start with Republicans first because it's a Republican-controlled legislature. The more Republicans I get, the more the legislation is going to be taken seriously. And on a House bill, you can only get a total of 11 sponsors on a single bill. So once I got 8 Republicans, I then started to get some Democrats, but I had to cap it at 11. But when I got to the 11th sponsor, another delegate, a delegate named Barbara Fleischauer, who represents Monongalia County up in Morgantown, approached me and asked if she could be a sponsor of the bill. Well, I said, well, I'd gotten all the sponsors that I needed. She said, well, why don't I introduce an identical bill, and I could be the lead sponsor of that, and then you recruit my 10 other sponsors. I said, okay, if that's legal, and apparently it is, you can introduce as many identical bills on the same topic as you want, or as you can possibly get support for. So I end up getting an additional 3 Republicans on her bill, and we end up with 11 Republicans and 11 Democrats. sponsoring the legislation. And then a Republican House member approaches me, Charlotte Lane, and she wants to be a sponsor of the bill. So at this point I say, just introduce a third bill. And I recruit the 11 people on her bill as well. So we end up with 33 House members sponsoring this LGBT non-discrimination bill. It's phenomenal. We've never had that much support before. And consider 33, that's a third of the legislature. And they're not just legislators who will say they will vote for it. There were an additional 19 House members who said they would vote for the bill. They just didn't want to have their name on the bill. So in effect, I had 52 votes for this, a majority. And 33 of them wanted their name in neon letters on the bill itself. But the one thing standing in our way was the Speaker. Because, as I told you, he is very anti-gay and will not allow any bills with reference to sexual orientation or gender identity to even come up for a vote. So even though a bill might have a majority of support in his chamber, he can basically sit on it. He can squash it so that it never sees the light of day. And that's what he did. So we know that we're poised to win this. We just need the right leadership. So hopefully in the next election, there will be a change in leadership. Well, we know there's going to be a change in leadership because the Speaker is not running for re-election. So that's a plus. But we're going to need to make sure that a lot of good, progressive, social justice-minded legislators are elected next year so that we can get this done finally. Now I'll talk about the local municipal ordinances. That has been a very successful part of our work because we know that West Virginians are clamoring for this. We had a poll done back in 2013 that showed that 68% of West Virginians believe there should be non-discrimination protections for LGBT. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is borne out by our success in the communities. So when I first took over this job, I got to know this guy who was responsible for help for basically rehabbing buildings on the west side, and he's from Thurmond, West Virginia. This very, very, very small town. Used to be sort of a booming coal area, but since coal has left the region, it's now almost a ghost town. And in this town, he's one of 5 residents. It's a town of 5 people, population 5, and all 5 of them are on their town council. And so I mentioned,
It's not far from here.
yeah,
It's right around the corner.
that's right. That's right. I mentioned to him that our goal was to try to get communities around the state to adopt LGBT non-discrimination protections in lieu of the state being able to act on this. And he said, well, why don't we do this in Thurmond? I said, that would be awesome. And so within a couple of months, he talks to his family members who are half of the city council, and the other family that lives there is the other half. And they end up deciding to do this. And in February of 2015, they adopt the LGBT non-discrimination law. We, promote it, to the press, both locally and nationally. It becomes known as the smallest town in America with an LGBT non-discrimination law. Population 5. All 5 of them voting for it. It was unanimous. And it put West Virginia on the map. And as a result, that year in the legislature, they tried to adopt a law that would ban communities from adopting local non-discrimination laws. And we called it the Abolishing Local Liberty Law. And they rammed it through the committee at the very last moment, the House Government Organization Committee. It pretty much passed along party lines. But fortunately, we'd gotten wind of it just before it came up for a vote in the committee. So we asked for a public hearing. And we got 56 people to show up at that public hearing. They were from all walks of life. They were city council members who had voted for these non-discrimination ordinances in their communities. They were church leaders. They were business officials, business people who didn't want to see loss of business because West Virginia develops a reputation of being unfriendly to the LGBT community, and just other people who cared about this issue. And as I said, our opposition, the Family Policy Council, was only able to recruit 4 people, one of them being, the president, and then 3 pastors and preachers from this area, from Beckley, or from the surrounding area. And it was by that time, by the public hearing, that we learned that we had gotten so many people to contact their legislators complaining about this bill. The bill was basically dead. It was sent back to the committee to die. And so we haven't had to deal with that issue since, thankfully. But on the flip side, we've had enormous success in getting more towns to adopt these ordinances. So in 2016, as I said, we ultimately succeeded with Lewisburg. Now, it was probably one of the most tense and stressful fights that we've ever had in a community, as I said, because the Family Policy Council tried to stir up this hatred towards transgender West Virginians. And by the time they had their city council meeting, when they were going to have their vote, they had to move the city council meeting from the city council chambers to the osteopathic school so they could have the capacity to accommodate the up to 500 people they were expecting. And over 400 people showed up. And because of the tension that was evident, that was stirred up there, they were worried about violence. So they had a full detail of state police present. They even made each side enter through separate entrances. You had to divulge if you were pro or con when you got out of your car in the parking lot, because the state trooper then would direct you to the appropriate line. And once you got into the auditorium, you had to sit in the row of seats of where people of like-minded views sat. They didn't intermix people of different opinions. Again, worried about the violence. So the meeting started at 7 p.m. that evening, and they started with taking public comment. And there were about 40-some people in support of the non-discrimination ordinance, and there were 40-some people opposed to it. And all of the people opposed to it, their only concern was about the bathrooms. If this ordinance banning discrimination was adopted, they believed men would start sexually assaulting women in the women's restrooms. Basically what's known as a dog whistle. Basically making people more scared of transgender people. And basically, after the public comment was done, it was 12:30 in the evening. And finally, the city council had a chance to weigh in. Well, one city council member named Mark Eden turns to the city attorney and he says, "Are there currently any laws regulating the use of public restrooms?" The city attorney says, "No, sir, there are not." So does that mean that a transgender woman can currently use the women's restroom and there's no law barring her from doing so? Is that correct? Yes, sir, that is correct. All right. So then if we adopt this ordinance, that's not going to change anything. Is that correct too? Yes, sir, that's correct. Thank you. No further questions. Then the city council member turns to the police chief. Chief, if we as a city council end up adopting this ordinance, will you enforce the laws against sexual assault just as vigorously as you've done so in the past? And the chief said, "Yes, sir, we'll continue to enforce the laws just as forcefully as we've done previously. Thank you. No further questions." And he's basically taken the wind out of their sails. Then, as they vote, one by one, they vote unanimously to adopt this non-discrimination ordinance. It set the tone for the entire year, because 2 weeks later, the Martinsburg City Council, also under the same attacks, adopted their non-discrimination ordinance unanimously. And then a month later, Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and their city council adopts their LGBT non-discrimination ordinance unanimously. Then a few months later in Charlestown, they also adopt an LGBT non-discrimination ordinance. And then finally, at the end of the year in December 2016, the city of Wheeling and their city council adopts an LGBT non-discrimination ordinance unanimously. We adopted 5 municipal non-discrimination ordinances that year, doubling the number of non-discrimination laws in the state in 1 year. And at the end of that year, we heard from a national LGBT organization that West Virginia adopted more municipal LGBT non-discrimination ordinances than any other state in the country. So, yes, we were on a roll. And the following year, like last year, we ended up adding Morgantown to the tally. So we now have 11 municipalities in West Virginia with these laws. Well, it's great progress, but consider the total population in these 11 communities compared to the total population of West Virginia. So we have we're covering approximately 170,000 people or so. But the state's population is 1.8 million. So consider how many people are without these protections. And what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what that means. I'll tell you the story of Sam Hall. Sam Hall was a coal miner in Elkview. And he was in a same-sex relationship at the time. He really, initially, no one knew that he was gay. But it's small-town West Virginia. Eventually, word got out. And people on the job started calling him faggot. And it got bad enough to the point where he complained to his supervisor. His supervisor refused to do anything. Then his car was vandalized with the word faggot scrawled on it. And shortly after that, his brakes were even tampered with. He started to fear for his life and his safety, particularly when he would go down into the mines. And when he didn't show up at the appointed hour for dinner, his partner, now husband, used to fear the worst. He would drive down to the mines looking for him, worried that something horrible happened to him. Unfortunately, nothing did in that respect, but he couldn't sleep at night worrying about this. So ultimately, because his supervisor, his employer, refused to do anything, there were no state laws barring this kind of behavior on the job, he ended up quitting. He took a job with a Dollar General store, making less than half the pay, and ultimately they both moved to Florida. That is sadly the story of West Virginia as we know it. We are losing population on a daily basis. I think of all the states, we lose more population than any other state in the country every year. We're expected to lose a congressional seat after 2020, after the 2020 census, because of how much population we've lost. And we've lost a congressional seat, I think, like last couple of censuses. So we're sort of atrophying population. It's a real problem. So how can we afford to continue this discrimination when we're losing the best and brightest people? It's not just that we're not unable to attract people to move here, we're also losing our young, talented, skilled, educated workforce because they're leaving. And we can't afford that. But I have hope because I believe, and this is why as a non-native West Virginia, I'm from New York, I believe in this place because I believe that West Virginians are unlike any people I've ever met. This is my second time in the state. I lived here from 2001 to 2007, heading up to ACLU West Virginia. Then I got hired to be the executive director of the ACLU Connecticut for 7 years. And then I realized that West Virginia was the place where the friendships refused to fade. So I ended up moving back here in 2014 to head up Fairness. And I found more people here not only embrace me, but develop these really deep friendships that I've never experienced before. And I've had really good friends elsewhere, but not the kinds of people and friendships that I have here. I consider this to sort of be my second family. And I think part of that goes to it's not just the mindset and the persona, but it's the character of West Virginians. We're very poor, we're a very rural state, we've been the frequent victims of natural disasters, of crises, economic disasters, national corporations coming in and taking our resources and leaving us, to hang out and dry. I mean, it's horrible. We've suffered a lot. And I think it's that suffering that has made people here in West Virginia so, kind to each other, because we realize that's the only way we can be. We need each other to survive. That's why when there was the flooding, a year ago of last summer, you saw how many people came out for one another to help each other rebuild and to survive. And in every disaster, you see that happening. It's a special place. My first experience in West Virginia, 2001, I knew absolutely no one in the state. And my mom had put me in touch with with the family of a really close friend of hers in New York, who happened to live in Charleston. And they offered to put me up for a couple of nights while I searched for my first apartment. Well, as I was heading to their home, it was one of those super foggy days in July, right after a rainstorm. Very humid, like almost zero visibility. And I was driving up this hill to what I thought might be their house, but I wasn't sure if I was going the right way. And there was a car right behind me, and I must have been driving no more than 5 miles an hour, so the car looked like they wanted to pass. I pulled over to the side so that they could pass me, but instead of passing, the car pulled up right behind me, and the driver got out and approached my window. "Are you lost?" I said, "Well, I'm not exactly sure if I'm going the right direction." "Where are you headed?" And I mentioned that I was headed to this couple who was going to host me for a couple of nights. And he said, "Oh, I know them. Why don't you follow me? I'll take you there." So he basically escorts me to this house, and that's my very first West Virginia experience. And then I actually find this apartment in this sort of nondescript high-rise in Charleston, a block from the Capitol, so it'd be convenient for work. And I get my stuff moved in on my fifth floor apartment, and literally everyone in my hallway shows up to help me unpack. Now, if I'd come straight from New York City, that might have alarmed me. But because I had gone to school in the South, I was familiar with Southern hospitality, and I embraced it. And so I very quickly got to know my immediate next door neighbor, who was this unreformed 70-year-old from the Old South. And she seemed to take a liking to me. The local newspaper at the time, the Charleston Daily Mail, ran a profile of me as the new ACLU director. And she clips it out and she puts it on my doormat. And then I don't see her for another 5 days. And on a Sunday afternoon, as I'm leaving my apartment, she greets me. "Sweetie, I was going to cook you a real Southern breakfast, but I don't know if you like bacon, eggs, sausage, biscuits, or gravy, or if you're a vegetarian, or a bagel eater." So I figured she must have, discovered in the newspaper that I was from New York City, and therefore assumed that I subsisted entirely on a diet of bagels. So I had to disabuse her of that notion, because I love Southern breakfast, and the unhealthier, the better. And so then I don't see her for another 10 days. I'm coming home late from work on a Wednesday evening. And as I get out of the elevator, she is there to greet me once again. "Honey, can you help me with my typewriter? I don't know what's wrong with it." "I'm not the handiest guy in the world. I think you're asking the wrong person." "Won't you please take a look at it? You might be able to help." So I go into her apartment. It's just a matter of plugging the cord in the socket. "Won't you please stay for dinner?" So I stay for dinner, and all she can talk about is how much she hates the ACLU. She accuses me of trying to kick God out of the classrooms. She tells me it bothers her to see black men with white women in the common pool area. She tells me that she despises lesbians and she hates feminists. So I think to myself, this is not someone I'm going to have a deep, long-lasting relationship with. And I politely thank her for dinner, and I start to make my way towards her door. But I don't get very far before she tugs in the back of my shirt. Andrew, do you know your neighbors Larry and Michael? Yeah, I met them. Well, they're lovers. I said, yeah, I kind of figured that out. Thinking she wanted to give me some parting gossip because that is, after all, the national pastime in West Virginia. So then I start to make my way closer to her door, and I don't get very much farther before she tucks in the back of my shirt once more. Andrew, are you gay? I take a few seconds to think that over, and then I realize she's a 70-year-old woman. She's not going to do me any harm. And I said, yeah. And her eyes light up. Really? Well, that's wonderful, because I love gay men because they're so much like women. Which, not exactly how I think of myself, but if that was enough to create the common ground, I'm cool with that. And so she ended up becoming like an adopted mother to me. She would look after my newspapers when I was on the road. She would fill me in on apartment gossip. And she would even occasionally take care of me when I was sick. And, of course, we also press each other's buttons in a sort of playful way. When, she saw an ACLU lawsuit headline in the newspaper, she would, rag me about it. And, I also returned the favor when I was, seeing a black man. I made a point of introducing him to her. But the point of the story is that this was one of the many relationships that I established that came about, the friendships that I had of all walks of life. It didn't necessarily were the people that I would normally gravitate towards. And that was what was unique about West Virginia. I could have these friends from all these diverse quarters, whether they be people of certain political views, certain socioeconomic strata. It didn't matter. People were just friendly here. And so when I left, as I said, these were the friendships that refused to fade. I would, normally I would leave a place like West Virginia, and in this case I moved to Connecticut. I made lots of good friends there, and supposedly those friendships in West Virginia should have faded away, but they didn't. And instead I would come back here 2 or 3 times a year on my vacation. I would use up all my vacation time to come back to West Virginia. And of course, my old next door neighbor, would insist that I include her on my itinerary of visits, and would insist that I come and join her for frozen margaritas, and then proceed to drink me under the table. So at one point I do divulge the fact that I have this running imitation of her, and she's like, "Oh Lord, you probably imitate me up and down the East Coast, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I am." And she grinned from ear to ear. So I love this place. I believe in this place. I think we can make this place as good as it ought to be by making it inclusive, by making it a great place to raise your family regardless of your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. I believe we can make this happen. It's going to take some work. It's not going to be handed to us on a silver platter, but I believe it's possible, and I'm so hopeful that I believe we can do this before half the country does it. That's why I'm particularly excited. I mean, if we're able to, in 1 year, get more municipalities to adopt these laws than any other state in the country, I believe that West Virginia can adopt the state law before 25 states do. And right now, as I said, there's only 18 states with these protections, 21 states, an additional 3 with some of those protections. And right now, it doesn't look like there's any other states that are, knocking on the door to get this done immediately. So if we do this in the next couple of years, we'll beat half the country. It will rewrite the narrative of West Virginia. And that's so important, folks, because we're not just dealing with the bias that we experience here towards LGBT people. We have to put up with the bias that we experience when we leave the state. People ridicule West Virginia. I can't tell you how many times I go back to see my family in New York, see my friends, and people reference Deliverance, the movie. And that wasn't even filmed here. It was filmed in Georgia. But yet, we have this reputation that we can't seem to get out from under. But we can do that if we show the rest of the country and the rest of the world that we're not what people think we are. And I think that's very possible. So I want you all to join me in getting involved in our fight, in our struggle, and our efforts. I have some sign-up sheets where I'd like to get your information so that we can keep in touch. So we send it, now that the legislature is in session, we send out e-blasts from time to time informing our supporter base of what's going on in the Capitol, what's going on in your municipalities. And if it comes to the point where there's a vote on a discrimination bill, we'll even ask you in these emails to contact your legislator and who to contact and what their phone numbers are, so that we can have the same impact that we've had in defeating those discrimination bills the last 3 years. We've been in a position where we've been able to prevent any anti-gay legislation from passing, and we want to continue that streak. So please fill this out with your name, your address, your email, and your phone number. I have a pen to go with it. And this, I'll take questions.